So we're going to talk about the second brain and the microbiome. So this was an article that was written 2015, a little ahead of the game, talking about the emerging field of nutritional mental health, inflammation, the microbiome, oxidative stress, and mitochondria function. We are not going to talk about all of these things today. We just don't have time, but we are going to talk about inflammation and the microbiome. And so you can see when we talk about mental health, we are getting way beyond just what Freud taught us. We're way beyond just looking at what happened in our childhood. All of that is, of course, very important. I believe everything from pre-birth to birth to all the way through the traumas that we encounter, the things that we get to do or don't get to do, all impact our mental health. But also at a physiological, biological perspective, looking at inflammation, the microbiome, whether we have gut dysbiosis or not, we'll talk about that in just a minute, oxidative stress, all these things all also impact the brain and how well people can heal from the external things that have occurred. This is just a paper that just says that the gut-brain axis represents the core rationale for the stage of this new discipline of defined as nutrition psychiatry. So the gut and the brain are connected. I'm going to show you how in just a minute. This is the digestive system. And when we talk about the gut, we are talking about the entire GI tract, from the mouth to the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, including the colon and the rectum. And this, I love the enteric nervous system. It connects us to the outside world, and it also protects us from the outside world. So it's open at the beginning and it's open at the end. So we are exposed to all kinds of things through our mouth, and we get rid of things through our anus. So there's this whole bunch of stuff that occurs that is amazing. It is lined with 100 trillion bacteria, which is about 4 pounds worth. And it's mostly in the large intestine. And it's called that group of that bacteria is called the microbiome. It is considered a separate ecosystem. And it enables us to absorb nutrients, and it helps with our immune function. It can help with cognition. The vagus nerve connects the brain to the gut. So even as a new fetus that is just a cluster of cells, the brain and the gut are the same cells, but then they break apart, and then they obviously form their own parts, but they are connected by this vagus nerve. And I'm sure most of you have heard of the vagus nerve because we talk a lot about that when we talk about self-soothing and helping to get people to self-regulate, because we want to activate the parasympathetic nervous system by activating the vagus nerve. So that vagus nerve is the bidirectional system that allows the brain and the gut to talk to each other. So we have more nerve endings in our GI system than in our spine. 95% of serotonin is actually made in our gut. In fact, all neurotransmitters are made in our gut, and the neurotransmitters rely on protein adequacy and the ability to fully digest those proteins in order to create those neurotransmitters, which then move up through the vagus nerve to the brain. 90% of neurons in the vagus nerve go from the gut to the brain. And like I said, your gut is home to 100 trillion bacterial species. Bacterial cells are a 1-to-1 ratio with our cells. So we are a very pro-hygiene society, and certainly since the pandemic, it's gotten even worse, where there's hand sanitizer everywhere and people worry about bacteria. But the reality is that some bacteria is good, and we need it. And so killing off a lot of bacteria can actually be detrimental to our health. So we're going to talk about the microbiome and gut dysbiosis. Okay, So the Human Biome Project was done in the early 2000s, 2010. I forget exactly when it started, but it was two parts. They had phase one and they had phase two. So in phase one, they looked at the population of microbes that lived on our bodies. And so they had 150 people from Houston, and then they had 150 people from St. Louis who all participated in the study. And the bacteria was taken from 18 different sites over 2 or 3 times over their whole body over the course of 2 years. And then they mapped out what they found, and they looked at what were the characteristics of these healthy individuals. The second phase was done in 2013 to 2015, and they studied what the microbiome and the human hosts were doing and how they responded to 3 common conditions: preterm birth, inflammatory bowel disease or IBD, and type 2 diabetes onset. And so the goal was to look at the characteristic signals that might be associated to the onset of these conditions by comparing the original group that was a healthy group versus the second group that had these conditions. And what they found was that bacteria is uniquely yours, very much like a fingerprint. It's impacted by your life history. In fact, I was reading in one of the studies when they were talking about the microbiome, they said that they were even able to tell in some cases whether somebody had a college education or if they lived in a rural community versus a city, an urban community, by their microbiome. And it interacts with the environment, it interacts with diet, and it interacts with medication. Again, this whole community of bacteria plays a key role in the health of your brain. It helps in protecting the gut lining. It helps with nutrient absorption, synthesizing vitamins and neurotransmitters. Once we've eaten food, so when we eat food, when you start to chew food, I should go back to that picture. In our mouth, we have enzymes that help to start breaking down carbohydrates. And that enzyme is called amylase. And so we chew our food and it breaks down, and then we swallow it through the esophagus, and then it ends up in our stomach where there are more enzymes where it helps to break down more. And then when it goes into our small intestine, that's where some of that absorption, synthesizing the vitamins, trying to figure out, kind of like triaging, okay, what's here? What do I need to do? Where do I divvy it out? And then it moves into the large intestine where the water is removed, and then we pass out the waste. It helps us to manage our immunity, our appetite, our blood sugar levels. It's an integral part of our health. So this is a great little medical illustration. I know it looks a little bit confusing, but I'm going to show you some research that's going to help to illustrate this better. But if you look at the top of this where it says that there could be a behavior change, and that behavior change creates a thought, maybe a negative thought, or maybe a behavior of some sort. And that negative thought, let's say somebody has been abused, and so they've had some trauma, that is going to affect their gut physiology and change the way that their gut is working. And in changing that gut bacteria, they end up with low-grade inflammation, chronic gut dysfunction, which can also create more symptom generation, including things like anxiety or depression. Sometimes we have a bacterial infection or dysbiosis that can impact the brain, and then we have behavior changes. I think we are seeing that with long-term COVID. So we knew very early that because people lose their sense of taste, that COVID is affecting the brain. And so there's still research going on people with long-term COVID and the behavior changes that might be going along with that. We might also see a bacterial infection or dysbiosis that creates low-grade inflammation that will create symptom generation. If you have ever treated a kid with PANDAS, PANDAS is an acronym that stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorders Associated with Strep. And it's a very specific kind of strep. So you could get a kid who gets down here on the B on the illustration labeled B, a bacterial or strep infection that creates pandas. And in pandas, the child will become have an acute obsessive compulsive disorder reaction. They might also become anorexic. They might have anxiety or irritability or sleep disturbances, mood swings. So a lot of different behavior changes that occur quickly simply because of this bacterial exposure. But if you can get the child treated in a timely way, those symptoms actually go away. However, if you do not treat them in a timely way, then it is possible that some of those mental health issues will become permanent. So it is very important, especially if you are working with children and a parent comes in and says, this kid was fine. And they did get sick, they had a sore throat. And now that all this crazy behavior, to start exploring pandas and hands. And the difficulty with this in particular is there aren't a lot of doctors who know how to treat it or who even acknowledge it as a real thing. In Atlanta, as far as I know, there's one guy who treats it. There may be more, but he is always booked. Very difficult to get an appointment with him. He's a great doctor, but really hard to get in.